I met Jack in college. We were young, full of dreams and unspoken promises. He came from a modest background, but his ambition burned brighter than anything I'd ever seen. I loved him for his drive, for his kind heart, for the way he believed that nothing was out of reach if you just worked hard enough. We were inseparable. We talked about everything, about growing together, about getting married one day, about building a future hand in hand. But then life happened. Jack's financial situation got worse, and eventually, he couldn't afford to stay in school. It was a punch to the gut. I had to make a choice, one that would change everything for me. I couldn't let him give up on his dreams. So I made a decision that felt like both sacrifice and necessity. I dropped out of college. I didn't think twice. I started working full-time, waitressing by day, stocking shelves at night. Every paycheck went to Jack: tuition, rent, food. It all went to him. And I didn't mind. I was exhausted, but I told myself over and over again, he's worth it. Our future is worth it. Jack graduated, landed a job at a prestigious company, and everything seemed like it was finally coming together. But somewhere along the way, things started to change. He stopped calling. At first, I thought it was just because he was busy, but weeks turned into months, and then months into silence. No messages, no visits, just emptiness. Heartbroken but still hopeful, I decided to go see him one afternoon. I made his favorite lunch, his favorite sandwich, some fruit, and a thermos of coffee. I thought maybe he just needed a little reminder of how much I supported him, how much I cared. I never expected that day to be the one where my world would come crashing down. I stood at the entrance of the building where he worked. The security guard wouldn't let me in, so I waited outside. It felt like hours before I saw him, and there he was, Jack, walking out of the building, with a woman by his side, a well-dressed woman. Her name was Rachel. She was the CEO's daughter. My stomach dropped, but I forced myself to call out to him. "Jack," I said, my voice shaky but strong. He froze. Rachel turned her head and looked at me, her lips curling into a smirk. She scanned me up and down, then laughed. "Seriously, Jack, this is your ex? She looks like she crawled out of a thrift store. Honey, you really dodged a bullet." My heart shattered. I turned to Jack, my eyes pleading with him to say something, anything. But he said nothing. He just looked away, avoiding my gaze like he was ashamed of me. Rachel sneered at me. "Go back to whatever small town you came from," she said, voice dripping with contempt. "People like you don't belong here." And then she stepped right over the lunch I had made for him, scattering rice, fruit, and memories all over the sidewalk. Jack followed her, without even a glance back. I stood there, frozen in the cold, feeling like I had just lost everything. I returned home that night, broken and empty. My parents held me as I cried, and when the tears finally stopped, my father simply said, "If you're ready, the family business is waiting for you." What Jack never knew, what no one ever knew, was that I came from a quiet but powerful family. We had built one of the most successful corporations in the state, but I never mentioned it. I wanted to make it on my own, to prove I could do something without relying on my family's name. But now, I had to step up. The decision wasn't easy, but it was clear. I took control. Years passed. I rose to the top of the company. And one day, I walked into a high-stakes board meeting, fully prepared. But when I stepped into the room, my heart skipped a beat. Sitting across from me was none other than Jack. He was a mid-level employee now, and his face went pale when he saw me. Rachel was beside him, fidgeting nervously. The room fell silent. They were caught off guard. But me, I was calm, composed, radiant. The years of pain and heartbreak had sharpened me, had made me stronger. I didn't fire Jack. I didn't humiliate him. I didn't want revenge. I simply reassigned him to a faraway division, a place where he would no longer be able to influence the company. And before I left the room, I said, "You owed me a life, but I'm not here to collect." Not long after that, the news broke. Jack and Rachel were under investigation for embezzlement and bribery. They were convicted and sentenced to prison. Everything Jack had chased, the wealth, the power, the status, vanished. He was left with nothing, and me. I found love again. Not with someone flashy or powerful, but with Daniel. Daniel was my childhood neighbor, the quiet boy who once helped me carry my suitcase to the bus stop. The boy who had always been there, in the background, waiting. Daniel didn't see me as a stepping stone. He saw me as a treasure. One evening, as we walked hand in hand down the old road by my family's vineyard, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. I looked up at the stars, smiling softly, and whispered, "I'm no longer waiting for someone who left. I am walking forward with someone who never did." And that, for the first time in years, felt like the future I had always dreamed of. The years that followed were a blur of change and growth. My role as CEO of the family business became my everything. I threw myself into it, learning the intricacies of running a massive corporation, making decisions that shaped not only my future, but the futures of so many others. The company, which had once been just a name I inherited, began to feel like mine in a way that was deeply personal. It became the place where I proved my worth, where I no longer needed anyone to define me. The past, especially Jack and his betrayal, started to fade into the background. But, despite my success, there was a lingering emptiness, something I couldn't shake. It wasn't a longing for Jack. No, I had long since buried that part of me, the part that once loved him so deeply. It was a longing for something simpler, something real, for connection, for someone who saw me as I was, not as a product of my family's legacy or the power I had come to wield. Daniel had become my anchor, the quiet boy from my past. He had always been there, even when I hadn't noticed, when I was too busy chasing something, trying to prove my own strength. He stood by, waiting patiently for me to recognize what truly mattered. And, finally, I had. We spent our weekends at his small house in the countryside, tucked away far from the corporate world I had built. We would take long walks through fields of green and talk about everything: life, our dreams, the future. With Daniel, I didn't have to wear the mask of the successful CEO or the woman who'd been hurt. I could just be me. It was a relief, in a way, that I hadn't realized I needed. I had found peace in him, a quiet love that didn't demand anything but my presence. He made me feel grounded. He made me feel seen. But not everyone understood. As the CEO, I had a public image to uphold, and Daniel didn't fit that image. He was a simple man with simple pleasures. He wasn't the flashy executive, the high-profile businessman people expected me to be with. And that, I realized, was part of what made me love him. It was a relief to just be. No power struggles, no expectations. He didn't need me to prove anything. He loved me for exactly who I was. As my business grew, so did our relationship. Daniel never asked for more than I could give, but I wanted to give him everything. I wanted him to be part of my life, in ways that no one else had ever been. But there were still moments when my past would catch up with me. I would see Jack's face in a crowd, hear his name mentioned in passing, and a jolt of old hurt would stir within me. It wasn't that I missed him, it was that I had let him take so much from me before I ever realized it. I never thought much about what Jack was up to after that day at the board meeting. I had closed that chapter. But life, as it often does, has a way of bringing the past back when you least expect it. One afternoon, I was in the office, going over a series of financial reports when my assistant walked in, holding a folder with the company's latest public filings. She set it down on my desk and hesitated, as if unsure whether she should say anything. "There's something you should see," she said. I looked up from my work, already knowing what was coming. I had learned, over the years, that nothing was ever as simple as it seemed in the world of business. Nothing was ever purely business. I opened the folder. There, staring back at me, was Jack's name. It turned out that he had been working for a rival company for years now, a competitor who had been gaining ground in markets we'd long since dominated. But what really made my stomach drop was the section that outlined a series of underhanded dealings, something I had suspected, but never confirmed. Jack had been involved in insider trading, bribing suppliers, and even helping to siphon funds from companies just like mine. It was ugly, and it hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just business, it was personal. He hadn't just left me behind. He had betrayed everything we'd promised to each other. The future we had built in our heads was built on lies. But this time, I wasn't going to let it destroy me, the Emily who had stood on that cold sidewalk years ago. Watching Jack walk away without a second glance wasn't the same person anymore. I had grown stronger. I had made my peace with my past, and I wasn't going to let him destroy everything I had worked for. I made the decision to act swiftly. I initiated an investigation into the company Jack had been working for, pulling all the strings necessary to expose the corruption. It wasn't for revenge. It was for justice. For every person Jack had deceived, for every dollar he had stolen, for every dream he had crushed. I didn't give it much thought. I simply did what I had to do. Weeks passed, and the scandal began to unfold. Jack was implicated, as I knew he would be. News outlets picked up on it, and soon, the whole world knew. The company he had worked for was under investigation, and Jack's name was all over it. His empire of lies crumbled just as quickly as it had been built. He was arrested, and Rachel, who had always stood by his side, was right there with him, her role in the scandal just as damning. They were both convicted, sentenced to prison. Everything they had worked for, everything they had stolen from people like me, gone in an instant. But I wasn't celebrating. I didn't need to. I had already moved on. I had already won. What I hadn't anticipated was that, in the aftermath of all of it, the quiet joy I had found with Daniel only deepened. He had stood by me, not just as my partner, but as my foundation. We had made it through the chaos of my past, and now we could finally start to think about the future. One evening, after the dust had settled, Daniel and I walked down the old road near my family's vineyard. The sun was setting, casting a soft golden glow over the rows of grapes. I could feel his hand in mine, warm and steady. "I'm no longer waiting for someone who left," I whispered, the words coming easily now. "I'm walking forward with someone who never did." And for the first time in years, I felt truly free. I was no longer defined by what I had lost, or by what had been taken from me. I was defined by the choices I had made, the strength I had found within myself, and the love that had quietly, steadily, become the most important thing in my life. The months after the scandal broke felt like a whirlwind, but somehow, amidst all the chaos, things started to settle. The company, once rattled by the fallout of Jack and Rachel's actions, was regaining its footing. The employees who had once looked at me with skepticism now looked to me with respect. I had proven that I could weather any storm, no matter how personal it was. And yet, even with everything moving forward, there was still something deep within me that hadn't quite healed. The wounds from Jack's betrayal had scabbed over, but they weren't fully closed. I wasn't angry anymore. How could I be? I had learned that anger only weighed you down, that revenge only gave temporary satisfaction. But there was still a quiet hurt that lingered, the kind of hurt that comes from realizing that someone you loved could so easily turn their back on you. I knew I had moved past Jack and what he had done. I had my family, my company, and most importantly, Daniel. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when something would remind me of the girl I once was, the girl who had made so many sacrifices for someone who didn't deserve it. And that's when I would look over at Daniel, and everything would feel right again. Daniel, with his quiet smile and steady presence, he was my constant. He didn't demand anything from me, except for my time, my honesty, and my heart, and I was willing to give him all of those things. It wasn't long before we started talking more seriously about the future, about what we wanted, about how, in many ways, we had already built something. We had something Jack and I never had: an unwavering partnership. With Daniel, there were no games, no power plays, no pretenses. He just loved me for who I was, and I loved him for who he was: quiet and steady, always there when I needed him. One evening, as we were sitting on the porch of his house, watching the sun dip behind the hills, Daniel turned to me with a question that caught me off guard. "Emily," he said softly, "have you ever thought about getting married?" The question hung in the air for a moment, and I didn't know how to respond. I had never really allowed myself to think about marriage. It wasn't that I didn't believe in it, but after everything that had happened with Jack, I wasn't sure if I was ready to open myself up to that level of commitment again. "I don't know," I said quietly, turning my gaze to the horizon. "I never really thought about it. With everything that's happened, I guess I didn't want to risk something else breaking." Daniel reached over, his hand covering mine, warm and reassuring. "You don't have to rush into anything, Emily," he said. his voice steady and calm. "But I want you to know that I'm here, for all of it, whatever you need, whenever you're ready." His words wrapped around me like a blanket, comforting me, making me realize that he was the one who had never left, the one who had never made promises he couldn't keep, and that was enough for me. We didn't need grand gestures. We didn't need the flashy engagement rings or the extravagant proposals. What mattered was the way Daniel showed up for me every single day. What mattered was that I knew, deep in my heart, that he would always be there, no matter what. And yet, despite the peace I found with him, there was still this undercurrent of restlessness in me. I had built this company from the ground up, fought for every success, every deal, every victory. But what had I really built? A legacy? A name? Or had I been building something for myself, trying to prove that I was worth something, that I could overcome the hurt of my past? It was the questions I couldn't answer, the pieces of myself that still felt fractured, that kept me up at night. One day, not long after that conversation with Daniel, I received an unexpected visitor at the office. It was my father. He had never been one to just drop by unannounced, so when I saw him standing in the lobby, waiting for me, I knew something was up. "Dad, what's going on?" I asked, walking over to greet him. He smiled, but there was something in his eyes, something that said he wasn't here for a casual chat. "Let's go for a walk," he said. I followed him down the long corridors of the building and out into the gardens. We walked in silence for a few minutes before he spoke. "Emily, I know you've been working hard to prove yourself, to build something that's yours, but I want you to understand something important," he said, pausing to look at me. "You don't have to carry all of this alone." I felt a lump form in my throat. My father had always been supportive, but he was also a man of few words. His approval meant everything to me. But this felt different. It felt like he was trying to say something more, something that I wasn't quite ready to hear. "You've spent so much of your life proving that you can do it on your own," he continued. "But what I've learned over the years is that the real strength comes from knowing when to ask for help and from knowing when to accept it." I nodded, taking in his words. I had always thought I had to prove myself to the world, that I had to build everything from the ground up, without anyone's help. It was something I learned from my experiences with Jack relying on others, only led to disappointment. But hearing my father's words, I realized that there was strength in letting others in sharing the burden. "I've built this company, Dad," I said, the words feeling heavy in my chest. "But sometimes, I wonder if I've built it for the right reasons. Am I doing this for me? Or am I doing it to prove something to the world? To people who aren't even here anymore?" My father placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "Emily, you've built something remarkable. But don't forget to build your life too. You don't need to keep running from the past. Let it go. You deserve happiness, not just success. Don't wait for permission to take it." His words settled in me like a seed, and for the first time in a long while, I realized that I didn't need to keep holding on to the past. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone, not to Jack, not to the world, not even to myself. That night, when I got home, I sat down with Daniel and told him everything, about my fears, about the burden of expectation, about the weight of the past I had carried for so long. And he just listened. That's all he did. He listened, and he held my hand. When I finished, he gave me a soft smile. "You don't have to have it all figured out," he said. "We'll figure it out together. But you're not alone anymore." Not in this, I realized, in that moment, that I had already taken the first step toward healing. I had let go of the pieces of myself I had been holding onto so tightly. The past no longer had the power to define me. And I didn't have to rush into the future, either. I just needed to live in the present, to take each day as it came. With Daniel by my side, we didn't need a grand plan. We didn't need answers to every question. All we needed was each other, and the quiet understanding that, together, we could face whatever came next. As the months passed, things in my life began to shift in a way I had never anticipated. After the conversation with Daniel and my father, I began to let go of the heavy burden I had carried for so long. I stopped trying to prove to myself and to everyone else that I could do it all alone. Instead, I focused on building something more meaningful than just a successful career. I focused on my relationships, on Daniel, and on creating the life I had always wanted but hadn't known how to find. Daniel and I grew closer, our connection deepening with every shared conversation, every quiet moment together. We spent weekends at his house, walking through the vineyards near my family's property, sitting by the fire, talking about everything and nothing. It wasn't the excitement or the whirlwind of a new romance that kept me grounded. It was the simplicity, the steadiness, the knowing that this was a partnership, not a performance. For the first time, I felt like I was truly living, not just surviving, not just pushing through the motions. I was allowing myself to be present, to savor the small moments that used to feel insignificant in the rush to get to the next milestone. And I wasn't doing it alone. I had Daniel by my side, and that made all the difference. It wasn't long before I started to make more personal decisions about my future decisions that didn't revolve around my company, my business, or the reputation I had built. I began to look at my life in a way that wasn't just about success, but about fulfillment. One evening, as we sat on the porch of his house, Daniel turned to me, his gaze thoughtful. "Emily," he said quietly, "I've been thinking about something, about us." My heart skipped a beat, unsure of where this was going. But then he smiled, a small, tender smile that made everything feel right. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," he continued, his voice steady. "I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Not just as a partner, but as your husband. I want us to build a future together, the kind of future you deserve." I looked at him, the man who had never left, the man who had always been there for me, and felt a rush of emotion. I hadn't expected this, but somehow, it felt right. I had never really considered marriage before, but in that moment, I realized that it wasn't about the grand gestures or the public displays. It was about being with someone who saw you for who you truly were, who accepted you, flaws and all. "Yes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I want that too. With you." The decision was simple, but it was everything I had needed. I wasn't rushing into it out of a need to fix the past or to make up for what had been lost. I was doing it because I had found the one person who made me feel whole, someone who didn't demand anything from me except to be myself. And in return, I could give him the same. A few months later, we were sitting in a small chapel near my family's vineyard, surrounded by a few close friends and family. The ceremony was simple, no lavish decorations, no flashy displays, just the quiet beauty of a commitment made in the presence of those we loved. And as we exchanged vows, I realized that this was the life I had always wanted, not the one built on ambition or recognition, but the one built on love, trust, and partnership. After the ceremony, we went outside, hand in hand, and stood together as the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light over everything. It was one of those moments that felt timeless, where everything seemed to align perfectly. For once, I wasn't looking ahead to the next challenge or the next milestone. I was simply here, with Daniel, living in the moment. "I'm ready for whatever comes next," I said, looking at him with a smile. He smiled back, his eyes filled with affection. "As long as we're together, I'm ready for anything." We spent the next few days in a blissful haze, enjoying our honeymoon in a quiet cabin by a lake, far away from the pressures of the outside world. It was there, in the peaceful stillness, that I realized something important. I had spent so much of my life defining myself by what I could achieve, by the things I could build, by the successes I could claim. But what really mattered was the love I had found, the people I had chosen to keep close, and the life we had begun to build together. As the days passed, I thought about Jack and how, in a way, his betrayal had pushed me to become the person I was today. But I also realized that I didn't need him to complete my story. I didn't need anyone's approval or validation. I had Daniel, and that was enough. I had the peace of knowing that I was finally living for myself, and for the people I loved. The past was just that past. I had moved on from it, not out of bitterness, but because I had learned to see what truly mattered. The years of heartbreak, the struggles, the sacrifices, they had all led me here, to this moment, with Daniel by my side. One afternoon, as we walked hand in hand through the vineyard near my family's home, I paused and looked around at the rolling hills, the green vines, the distant mountains. This was my world now, Not a world defined by ambition or power, but by the simple joys of life, the love of family, the warmth of friendship, the quiet peace that came from knowing I was exactly where I was supposed to be. "I'm no longer waiting for someone who left," I whispered again, the words feeling even truer now than they had before. "I'm walking forward with someone who never did." And as I stood there, with Daniel's hand in mine, I knew that this was just the beginning. We had built a life together, not on grand gestures or promises, but on the quiet understanding that we were enough just as we were.